Welcome to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where I interview the thought leaders, innovators, and executives shaping the future of flexible work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by the Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. The Flex Index represents more than 4,500 companies, 30,000 office locations, and 100 million people. It's a great place to start if you're looking for your next flexible work career opportunity. Hello, and welcome to the Flex Perspectives podcast. My name is Rob Sadow. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Scoop. Today, Arpit Gupta, the Associate Professor of Finance at NYU Stern, believes that we could be in for a commercial real estate apocalypse. So what's happening? Who's going to be impacted? How do stakeholders think about this? And how should they insulate themselves as best as possible around what's coming? Today's conversation is a must listen, not just for real estate professionals, but company leaders, public officials, anybody that's impacted by what's happening in the downtown urban core. But first, Arpit, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit about your background. So you started as an associate professor of finance at NYU Stern School of Business, I believe back in 2016. What led you to this topic and becoming passionate about this area?
Well, I graduated from college in 2009, and it was a pretty rough year to graduate from college. I had done some research work at the Chicago Fed, looking at the impact of the foreclosure, the financial crisis. And just looking around me, I saw that none of my friends were getting jobs. This was one of the worst economic downturns we were suffering. And I saw that real estate was really at the center of it. So I decided this was an area I really wanted to dig into. And so I ultimately wound up getting a PhD in the area, really trying to study the financial crisis, the causes of the stress that so many households suffered. And it just kind of deepened my interest in research as an area. More recently, I've started to look at commercial real estate as well, and in particular, thinking about the impacts that the pandemic and particularly the remote work impacts of the pandemic might have on the commercial real estate asset class.
So I graduated college in 2008, so I'm right there with you and remember those days. I don't know if fondly is the right description, but I certainly remember them. So talk about a little bit what's happening, like what is driving such a potentially dramatic upheaval in the office space business?
Absolutely. So first, let's just start with a big picture of facts of what's kind of happening on the ground, right? So across the whole nation, we're looking at an office vacancy rate of something like 17%. And when you look at the large metropolitan areas like New York City or San Francisco, that number is really more like 25%. So 1 in 4 square feet of office space is up for leasing by new tenants. And you look at the number of people that are physically going into the office, and that's kind of stabilizing at about 50% kind of across the country. So in most metropolitan areas, about half the people are coming into the office who were formerly coming in before the pandemic. So this just sort of reflects the extent to which remote work has really redefined what it means to be an office worker. That in turn is really changing how firms are thinking about their space needs, how best they're deciding to accommodate the work needs of their employees. And that is then having trickle-down effects on what the entire office real estate asset class looks like.
Yeah, and that data fits pretty closely with what we see in the Flex Index, where companies that have a structured hybrid model, generally 2 to 3 days a week in the office, and so that 50% number makes a lot of sense. You talked a little bit about the percentages, the vacancy rates. What's the potential impact? Like if you were to size that for NYC or for the United States, like how do you think about the magnitude of it?
Yeah, so we've done some research. This is work joint with Steinman Neuberg and Brenda Mittel. And we've tried to quantify the likely impacts of the shock for the office real estate asset class. And our estimates suggest that cities like New York can expect to see a 40% decline in the value of commercial office real estate compared to the value before the pandemic. And this destruction in value is likely to persist for many coming years, reflecting the likely persistence of remote work. If you take that number and aggregate that kind of across the whole country, you get something in the range of $400 to $500 billion. So we're looking at potentially a very large dollar shock to this entire asset class.
And is that distributed evenly across urban markets? So is New York going to get hit the same or harder or less hard? Like what's the sensitivity there?
Absolutely. So we definitely see a lot of really interesting heterogeneity, both across geography, industry, as well as different types of buildings. So looking across geographies, it's definitely the case that, as your intuition might suggest, cities like San Francisco, but especially cities like Portland, Seattle, even Los Angeles, really a lot of the West Coast metros appear to be really badly affected. By contrast, some of the Sunbelt areas, your Miamis, your Austins, they appear to be holding up a lot better. That sort of reflects, in part the fact that they didn't really seem to lock down to the same extent. And so people continued to go to the office throughout the pandemic, and they just have a different culture. There's a different attitude towards being in the office. And so office attendance seems to be higher in a lot of these Sunbelt markets. And New York City is sort of at least in between those two extremes, but still seems to be fairly badly impacted and just has a lot of office asset class in general. So the dollar magnitude of the shock there is pretty strong. The other really meaningful point of heterogeneity is across the quality of the building, because it's the A+ buildings, it's the really high amenity, young, new buildings that appear to be holding up a lot better, whereas it's the older buildings that are at risk of becoming sort of functionally obsolescent, right? It's these 70, 80-year-old buildings where people don't really want to come to them anymore. They actually already have environmental impacts that have been making them kind of obsolete for other reasons. And they're really the asset class that is most at risk of being disrupted.
Got it. And it's interesting because as I think about commercial real estate, a lot of the time, those leases are long leases, right? They could be 10 years long. And so in some ways, I imagine maybe that shields the economy or shields a number of different stakeholders because it doesn't all happen in a single year, for example. But at the same time, that's going to impact it at some point in theory. And so how should we think about time horizon? And is this near term, medium term, 2030? What are we looking at in terms of when you would feel the brunt of that impact?
That's a great point. And even at this point, for the last couple of years, we've only seen a minority of firms have to actually make an active space decision, right? In the sense that they've had a lease that's come up due and they've had to make a decision on what to do with that space afterwards. You still have the majority of firms really haven't had to make a decision yet on what to do with their space simply because they were locked into a long-term lease. Now we're seeing that firms that are in a position to release their property are generally demanding shorter lease periods. So that whole relationship is changing a little bit structurally. But for sure, this existing long-term lease pattern means that this is much more likely to be a slow-moving train wreck. It's not the situation like we saw in 2008 with residential real estate, which all collapsed simultaneously. It's really something that's going to take many years to really play out because you have all of these long-term leases locked in, and it's just going to take time for that situation to resolve itself.
Got it. And I have to imagine there's a lot of different stakeholders, real estate and otherwise, that are impacted by this. Let's start to dig into that a little bit. So, first in the real estate ecosystem, who are the different folks that might be impacted, and to what extent, if what you're saying might play out actually comes to fruition?
Absolutely. So the first set of agents that are really most impacted by this are going to be the owners of commercial space, right? Because they own the buildings, they're collecting the cash flows, and they're going to be impacted, again, maybe not immediately, like we talked about, but over some period of time by the fact that firms really are rethinking and changing their space needs in ways that are going to impact the total leasing revenue that they're receiving from their space, right? So that's going to hit the large landlords. Some of these are large publicly traded companies in the form of REITs. There are also a lot of private landlords that own this commercial real estate space. And then there's a heavy involvement of institutional asset managers here too. So everyone from pension funds, life insurance companies, endowments, foundations, they're all fairly heavily involved in owning and operating this commercial real estate space. You also have brokerages, which are going to be really affected as well, because you're kind of seeing liquidity and transactions really dry up here. Because while we're predicting a large value drop, that really hasn't quite materialized yet in the primary markets for how these buildings are transacting. There's essentially a huge gap between what people are willing to sell at and what people are willing to buy at. So that means transaction volumes are really down. That, of course, affects anyone that is trying to earn brokerage revenue from the sale and transactions of these properties. But thinking a few steps down, if you think that, well, centers of cities are going to have big shocks to the number of people going to come in, that actually has huge implications for how cities work and how a lot of other stakeholders are going to be impacted. So you have impacts, for example, on retail and restaurants. These are commercial enterprises that formerly derived a lot of value from the commuters that were coming in to the centers of cities. And so we're seeing that employment and sales in these adjacent industries also appear to be quite affected by the decline in the commuting volume. And in fact, the transit agencies that are serving these commuters, the mass transit, also appear to be really badly affected. And there are huge concerns over whether they're going to be able to operate into the future. So you've got the direct impacts, but then also affecting adjacent commercial enterprises and kind of going out from there to affect just sort of businesses broadly that are operating in the centers of cities, all kind of taking the hit from the fact that you have this large decline in commuting volume.
And I imagine that extends even to tax dollars that are raised within cities, and how does that affect the finance of public governments or local governments in those areas? And how does that affect potentially quality of life within kind of like dense urban environments? Like, have you thought about, what are some of the public finance implications and ability to provide services and that kind of stuff?
Absolutely. So I think the parallel to think about is how a lot of these cities coped with the shocks that were experienced during the 1960s and 70s. So remember, this was a period when you had a lot of deindustrialization, and formerly the centers of cities actually used to have a lot of manufacturing activity right in the center, right? The meatpacking district here in New York was, formerly a hub for that kind of activity before it became full of clubs and so forth. And so the loss of all of those manufacturing industrial jobs really badly affected how a lot of cities worked, right? The jobs left, people left, and the knock-on consequences included increases in crime because you had less foot traffic. You had decreases in population as people are moving away to follow the jobs. And ultimately, you had amenities that the city was offering decline because of the resulting declines in tax revenue that happened as a result. So you had problems with schools, problems with public order. All these things kind of compounded on themselves into what we sort of think is a possibility of an urban doom loop, right? This possibility that the declines in the revenues might ultimately spiral because as cities struggle to raise more revenue or cut amenities, that's going to further drive some of the exodus. Now, in some cities like Detroit, I think we saw that spiral really continuing to a point where the urban environment got quite fragmented. In cities like New York, ultimately, they were sort of saved by the entry of the offices, right? Cities found new jobs and new opportunities to fill in the gap for manufacturing, and ultimately were able to kind of self-correct themselves. But it was a fairly rough period of several decades. And I'm not saying this is going to happen the same way in every single city. It obviously depends on the exposure to how much remote work there is. But I do think it's kind of the risk on the table that cities for the last decade have kind of taken their residents a little bit for granted, right? If you're San Francisco or you're New York, you think, well, of course, people have to live here because of the great job opportunities. Do I really need to offer that great of an amenity? Do I really need to offer a competitive tax environment? I think that these residents are kind of stuck. And now we're seeing that people have increased choice, and that's going to hopefully mean that cities also have to compete harder to retain and attract talent.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. One of the, and maybe we'll switch at this point from what I imagine has been a fairly negative, but an important kind of like realization in some ways in terms of where we might be going. If you believe that recognition of the situation you're in is an important starting point in terms of coming up with any solution, the fact that this is actually going to potentially take place over years, right, or decades, in some ways gives an opportunity for different stakeholders to think in advance about what they can do to start to shield themselves, change policy and approach. Let's kind of like pull back through that list of stakeholders. We could start with real estate and kind of move out from there. What should some of these different groups be thinking about in terms of how do they start to prepare themselves? How do they diversify or kind of like shield their exposure if this comes to fruition?
Well, I think the first step is thinking about how space can be reutilized given the fact that people want to use that space differently. So you're seeing that firms, when they do want to come in the office, really want to specialize their in-person activity for the types of things that are hard to do over Zoom, right? So before the pandemic, you had the idea that, well, everyone has to come in 5 days a week and they're going to do all their work at the office. Well, now you might be on more of a hybrid work system, right? So people are doing work at home a few days a week. And so for the few days a week that they are in the office, what's the right mix of space that you want to be able to offer that employee? It's not obvious that it's the same layout or design that you had before the pandemic, right? And so you're seeing a lot of space being transformed in this way, right? Maybe more conference space, maybe more ways of sharing space between employees. For example, hot desking, where employees can trade off desks, or the neighborhoods concept whereby space is divided out within an office into distinct uses and you can pick and choose whether you want to do a little bit more deep work or a little bit more collaboration. And ultimately, that all requires that the owners and operators of commercial space are able to change the utilization and change the layout in ways that are demanded ultimately by the tenants. Another big part of this is upgrading the quality of the space, because if I'm trying to encourage my employees to come in, I really have to offer a high amenity experience. And so that entails thinking about what are the sorts of amenities, what are the sorts of things that employees are looking for, and being able to offer those to encourage workers to come in.
Got it. And so beyond just encouraging, because ultimately you can do a lot of things to encourage employers to come in, but I imagine especially in a difficult macro environment, there's a lot of CFOs at companies that are thinking about real estate as an exposure point, an opportunity to potentially reduce the cost footprint. What can CEO or cities be doing rather to be thinking about how we use that space differently? Does it require rethinking of zoning laws and tax incentives to kind of change buildings around? Like how should cities try and get in front of some of that stuff?
Yeah, there's a really interesting history with how New York handled 9/11 and a lot of the downsides of office starting in the 1990s and continuing into the 2000s in Lower Manhattan in the financial district. So this is sort of an area that saw a large decrease in demand for office popping up over these couple decades. And the city was very aggressive in both offering tax incentives for firms that were willing to move in and keep workers on site, and also offer tax incentives through the 421G program for people willing to convert that office space to other uses, particularly to condos and multifamily. And that conversion process was quite successful in Lower Manhattan in transforming a whole neighborhood ultimately from what used to be a 9 to 5 work all the time neighborhood into really a live, work, play area. So a lot of great restaurants and bars have moved down there, attracted by the fact that you now have a much larger residential population as well. There are, of course, unique experiences with that neighborhood. So it is an area that has a lot of very old skyscrapers. That means you have a lot of very narrow footprints and floor plates in these buildings. That makes it actually easier to use conversions because you're typically stacking bedrooms along the perimeter with a window. And that's a lot easier to do with very old buildings compared to newer, more modern office blocks that are a lot wider in their floor plates. So it's not possible to do everywhere, but there are historic examples for how cities have successfully converted space, reutilized space. And I think it's going to be a mix of different changes in different neighborhoods, right? Some areas are going to be best suited for office because they can just upgrade the quality of the space and continue to attract people. Other buildings, again, particularly older buildings, those that are more suitable for conversion might be better converted to other uses, and that will require changes in zoning codes and so forth. Other buildings may just be functionally obsolescent, and there may be enough of a decline in remote work that there's even less demand for housing there. And then you have a really difficult conversation about what is the highest and best use of land in that case.
Do you think that some of the investors and kind of owners of commercial real estate are going to start diversifying further away from just office space and into more residential or other types of use to try and shield some of their exposure to that?
Absolutely. And I think that has been an ongoing process for the last few years. You know, look, office as an asset class was historically thought of as a core investment, meaning you can kind of think of this as a almost fixed income asset class. You just bought office and you didn't think twice. You're collecting cash flows. You almost think of the leasing revenue as sort of bond or coupon-like in nature because you take for granted that there's always going to be demand for the space. And we're now seeing it's really not that kind of asset class. It's a lot riskier. And so people are just rethinking their entire approach to this entire asset class. And so diversification makes a lot of sense, of course. In the last couple of years, we've seen this huge run up in apartment rents. But I think we're also now seeing that there's a little bit of a decline in apartment rents as well. And there's a lot of supply coming online. So I think there's a lot of risk and uncertainty in that asset class. At the same time, there's hotels, which have had a big rocky up and down boom across the whole pandemic. So it's not like there's any one asset category in real estate that's going to offer you solutions to all your problems. So certainly a diversified approach makes sense for a lot of investors thinking about the best way to manage their risk and return exposure in the sector.
Got it. And so, we talked about a number of scenarios, right? Like in theory, you could have a significant reversion back to where we were before. A lot more people come into the office, in which case, or companies requiring people to come into the office, in which case the effects are going to be more limited. It could be the bear case, right, where you have 40%, drops, as you talked about, and hundreds of billions of exposure across the United States in terms of office space pricing. what's your instinct based on what you're looking at in the data in terms of where you think we net out here and in terms of like the relative impact?
I think this is really an area where you're going to have multiple equilibria or multiple different settling situations across the country and the world. And one kind of intuition we have in economics is that when you see transitory shocks having really persistent long-term effects, that's usually because there's a lot of coordination at play. So the shock kind of takes all of us and we move to a whole new pattern of behavior. So what I mean by that more concretely is that if I want to come into the office, and I'm in the office right now, by the way, I'm in here, 5 days a week when I'm not traveling. But when I do come into the office, I really look to my colleagues, right? If the office is empty, there's not really a lot of value to me coming in. But if my colleagues are all here, it's a great time to come in. And so it's really the coordination and the complementarities between employees that make the whole thing critical. So what that means is if I'm in an industry or if I'm in a city or if I'm at a firm where everyone is remote, you can imagine that remote system persisting because it's a fully self-sustaining equilibrium. If I'm in a world where everyone is coming in every single day, that also is fully sustaining. And there's a big question on how you get from one to the other. What the pandemic did is it sort of temporarily forced all of us for a period of time to jump. And then we had this big resorting, right? We discovered that this remote work was something that was functional for some firms, some industries, some workers, and it really wasn't as functional for others. And so now we're still playing this game and figuring out, well, what are the cities, what are the industries, what are the firms for which this model works, and which are the ones that the old model works better. So that's sort of my intuition, is that it just sort of depends on how humans coordinate together. And we may end up in a world where, let's say San Francisco is pretty heavily remote, and let's say Austin and Miami are pretty heavily in person, and let's say Paris is pretty heavily in person, London is pretty heavily remote. I can imagine a world that's a lot more patchwork in that dimension.
Yeah, it's super interesting. It makes me wonder how much the actual profession of real estate consulting and kind of like the brokerage process itself is going to evolve, where so much of it maybe becomes how do you not only help a potential tenant find the right space, but also how do you make sure they're going to get the most out of that space? What's the right setup of it? How do they encourage employees to come into the workplace? Because that might be, to your point, a big driver of underlying demand.
Absolutely. The writer Derek Thompson talks about the need for a coordinator function at companies. So when we were all in person, we basically were able to coordinate with each other serendipitously, right? You run into someone at the water tank, water cooler, you knock on your colleague's door when you need to. All of the tasks of coordination were facilitated by the fact that everyone is in the same place physically, right? And so you don't need any particular person to have the responsibility for connecting others. And what you're seeing in a world that is fully remote is, well, you can still also get the benefits of that by having everyone be fully remote, and it's just a different equilibrium, and everyone just knows to coordinate and check in with each other in Zoom or Slack or whatever your digital platform of choice happens to be. And it's really this hybrid format, somewhere in between, that really calls for a new type of skill. Because if you're going to have people coming in a couple days a week, well, is this person coming in a couple days a week at the same time that someone else is coming in 2 days a week, right? Again, the benefits of being in person really are about connecting with others. And so you have to have some thought put into the task of figuring out, okay, well, when I'm coming in, who else is coming in? Because if I'm coming in 2 days a week and I never overlap with this other person, well, we might as well be fully remote in the first place. Or people are coming in and finding themselves in Zoom meetings all day in the office. And they're asking themselves, why did I come into the office just to be on Zoom, which I could have done at home in the first place? So I think there's a huge need for new types of coordination to help figure out how are all of us going to manage this world together. And I think that's compounded by the fact that firms have kind of taken advantage of these last couple of years, and they've hired aggressively. They've hired in different markets where they weren't before. They've hired internationally. They've hired through digital platforms, other workers outside the traditional firm boundary, right? Outsourced employees and contractors and things like that. And so the coordination challenges have really grown substantially in many companies.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And obviously a topic that's near and dear to our hearts at Scoop in terms of how do you think about this. And it certainly feels like there's a combination of people and process and software that's going to be required to make that really easy. And the the better that companies can get at coordinating and enabling employees to do that, the more likely they are to use their office space to probably kind of ameliorate some of the topics that you're raising in terms of potential impact. Any final thoughts on this topic, angles we haven't looked at, or things that we should be thinking about as you spent so much time studying this?
One thing I'm really fascinated by in my discussions is the difference in opinions between startups and mature companies on this dimension. Because when I talk to mature companies, they're really not worried about the cost of their office space. To some extent they are. You hear executives from Facebook and Google mention this in earnings calls and so forth, but their prime focus is really around kind of questions of employee engagement, right? They're really concerned about the culture of the firm. They really want to make sure that people are fully engaged and bring in their best ideas. And they're willing to pay a price for office space in order to help facilitate that. They also have a specific culture and a specific way of doing things that comes down from their legacy, right? Whereas when I talk to startups, it's a totally different conversation because these are companies that don't have a history or a legacy or a culture to worry about. They're a lot more cost conscious. And so they're really doing interesting, innovative stuff around this whole question. So one kind of comment I get commonly from startups in particular is this idea of, well, how do you financially recognize a lease in your accounting statement? What we kind of typically do, and my colleague also Demodoran here at NYU really emphasizes this point as well. We commonly recognize leases as operating expenses because we think, well, of course, you have to do things in operations and lease is just a required part of doing business. But another way of thinking about it is that really a lease is just an alternate way of financial ownership because I could buy the building and I would pay mortgage payments and that'd be an interest expense. Or I could lease the same unit of space. And it seems like you should recognize it similarly whether I buy it or I lease it. At the end of the day, what that means is that if I'm a young company or really any company and I'm thinking about what is the financial expense of making that lease payment, I should kind of think of that as capital-like in some sense. And I should think of that as really heavily dilutive to me if I'm a founder or to the other investors. And so I really need to think carefully about what is the value that I'm getting out of this that justifies the fact that it's really shortening my runway on other dimensions pretty aggressively. And so I see startups doing very interesting, innovative things to try to lengthen the runway a little bit and try remote in different ways. Now, what that means is that there's a lot of diversity in uses right now, and I don't know what the situation is going to look like in 5 years or 10 years from now, because the large firms 5, 10, 15, 20 years may well be the small firms of today that are experimenting and coming up with new tools and technologies to work remotely.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And, as a startup founder, if I take the kind of implication of what you're saying and think about our own experience where generally for a lot of early stage companies, when you're not profitable, your top expenses, at least pre-pandemic, were people, and then quite often real estate is a significant one. That likely means, and we're certainly seeing that in our Flex Index data with 80% of tech firms either being fully remote or employees' choice in terms of how often and whether they go into an office, that the earliest stage companies are the ones that are least likely to want to make that office investment in the early days. And one of the things that's really interesting about that to me is if you play that forward 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, and you assume that some of those early stage startups are going to be the growth companies of the future, right, in terms of what that looks like. What does that mean in practice? It means that you probably don't have any companies like that, or very few companies that were born out of a fully in-office environment, right? And today, when we look at the US mix, there's still 50% of firms that are fully on site, right? But as that kind of works its way through and more new companies become mature and public over time, what does that do for secular office demand in the same way you were describing? All right, super interesting. A few rapid fire questions for you at the end, just to touch on a couple of different topics. So let's learn a little bit more about you. So one, what was your very first job?
I worked at a furniture store in Asheville, North Carolina, where I grew up, and I was doing inventory, computer work, hanging around, not very glamorous.
What is the best book you've read lately?
I read Chip Wars by Chris Miller. It's a really fantastic look at the semiconductor industry and geopolitical tensions, industrial policy in that sector.
Got it. I know you mentioned that you're usually in the office every day. On video conference, are you typically a video conference video on type of person or video off type of person?
I'm usually video on, but particularly when I'm teaching, I don't really impose that on others. People can do whatever they want.
Got it. Movie or TV show you've watched recently that you are obsessed with?
It's not a very original pick, but I've really been enjoying Succession.
So good. So good. Favorite office snack?
I'm very anti-snacking. I avoid it at all costs between meals.
You're a better man than I am. Favorite piece of flexible work software?
I really enjoy Slack, honestly. I think it gets a lot of hate from different quarters, but if I'm thinking back to my pre-Slack life, my email was a complete disaster, and admittedly, my email is still a complete disaster, but I worry about what it would look like if I didn't have Slack.
Got it. One future of work or workplace thinker that you really respect and admire?
I really love the work that Nick Bloom has been doing. He's been a great intellectual leader in this space, giving out a lot of data, and it's a huge inspiration for a lot of us working here.
It's great. And one final question, if folks that are listening want to learn more about you and your research, where should they go or look you up?
So I'm on Twitter at Arbitrage, and that's also the name of my newsletter, arbitrage.substack.com.
Awesome. Arpit, super, super interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. And it'll be really fascinating to see over the coming years what happens and some of the topics that you were describing.
It was a great chat. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.